Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, cut off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
What you know, good and camp, you're listening to the And Campaign's Church Politics Podcast with Justin Giboney, a.k.a. Bishop Cooper's grandson. And the first question I have for you today is, what's your bracket looking like? You know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about March Madness. You know, you sat at the office at your desk last week on Thursday and Friday and watched some of them games. How's your bracket looking? Because if you're anything like me, number one, you started off this March Madness with nothing but guesswork. And I love the game of basketball. Don't get me wrong. I just, with my schedule, have not really had time to watch college basketball to the extent that I could make an educated guess. I'm just going to be honest with you. Usually what I try to do is at least watch the conference tournaments. And that way, after watching the conference tournaments, I can make, an educated guess as to who's going to do what or whatever. This time around, I'm going to be honest with you, it was nothing but guesswork and really choosing with my heart, right? So on Friday, two teams that I chose to go past the first round based on just, sentimental connection is number one, Vanderbilt University, and y'all all know why I chose that. But also Memphis, because Anthony Penny Hardaway coaches Memphis, and I like Penny. I like Memphis in general. And so I chose both of these teams to get past the first round. I think I even chose Memphis maybe to go to the Sweet 16 or past that. I don't know, man. And so I want to bring this message to you before you do a bracket. At least try to watch the conference tournaments if you want to make even an educated guess. And then, man, you can't just choose with your heart, bro. You got to be real with yourself. So right now, I've lost a lot of bragging rights because I just made some bad choices. And so I'm going to have to eat crow. I'm going to have to hear people's mouths for, the next year or so because I just wasn't, I didn't study to show myself approved. I didn't. And that's what happens when you are not prepared, when you have not been diligent about understanding the subject matter at hand. And I hope the rest of you did better than I did. But y'all know what it is, man. Let me give a shout out to all our patrons and supporters for supporting us in what we do here at the AND Campaign and the Church Politics Podcast. Look, there would be no AND Campaign and there would be no Church Politics Podcast without you. So I want to thank you. And you know that we talk about a lot of subjects in a way that not very many, if any, other podcasts do. And so for those of you who appreciate that, for those of you who have gone on patreon.com/churchpolitics and become patrons of what we're doing. And so, for instance, these people who become patrons, they're going to get another segment after this segment. But even more than that, we just appreciate you because you keep us going. And we think we have something to say, a vision for the church when it comes to engaging culture and politics. And we thank you for being part of that movement. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure that you like and subscribe. And I want all of you to continue to talk to people at your church, talk to people on the job and Christians that you know about the Church Politics Podcast, because that's really how we've been able to spread the word. So thank you all for your support. As it's been since the beginning of the year, this was another week that was just jam-packed with news and jam-packed with consequential decisions coming from the Trump administration. So I want to get into that today. So grab your Bible, get your mind right, and prepare to think not like a Republican, not like a Democrat, but to think like a Christian. And in order to think like a Christian, you have to know the scripture. So we're going to start with scripture. I want to go to Proverbs 16, verse 16. Is that all right with you? Proverbs 16, verse 16. How much better to get wisdom than gold, to get insight rather than silver? How much better to get wisdom than gold, to get insight rather than silver? My Bible readers know that Proverbs is full of passages about wisdom. Wisdom, of course, is the application of faith. Knowledge comes from learning, learning from education and instruction, and ultimately, all of that comes from God. So today, I want to talk a little bit about education. One of my close friends, a close brother, asked me to speak on the news about the Department of Education. So I'm going to speak on the news about the Department of Education. If that's what y'all want to hear, that's what we need to talk about today. So, as many of you know, last Thursday, President Donald Trump signed an executive order entitled Improving Education Outcomes by Empowering Parents, States, and Communities. In short, that's a euphemism for I'm dismantling the Department of Education. All right. Now, according to Time magazine, Trump said that the department will still keep some of its core necessities and that Congress will vote on whether or not to abolish it, since only Congress can officially dismantle a government agency. Now, with that statement, you can kind of see that Trump's anticipating the pushback that's going to come from what he's doing to the Department of Education, right? Because when they initially announced it, you didn't hear the recognition that actually only Congress can abolish the Department of Education. But what he can do is basically take all of its functions away from it and put it somewhere else. That's their argument, and they're anticipating others to come back and have some pushback because one would say they are taking some of what really is supposed to be within the power of Congress. Now, let's get into a little bit of the history on the Department of Education. So, our seventh president, Andrew Jackson, created what would eventually become the Office of Education in 1867. Now, at that point, it was only a cabinet level agency, so it wasn't doing all the things that the Department of Education has been doing. The Department of Education, as we know it, though, was created in 1979 under President Jimmy Carter. And almost immediately, you see conservatives calling to get rid of the Department of Education, some even going so far as to say that it's unconstitutional because the Constitution does not mention education in that regard. It basically leaves education to states and local governments. All right. Now, while it leaves education to state and local governments, the problem was that a lot of states and local governments weren't being just or equal in how they did education. So we can talk about how the civil rights movement addressed that. We can talk about Brown versus Board of Education and why it was necessary for the feds to step in and say, hey, this isn't right. Let's not leave that out of the history of this conversation. But let's go on. So President Ronald Reagan calls for the abolition of the Department of Education in 1982. But he never went through with it. Perhaps he had other priorities. Maybe he just didn't have the political capital to do that and other things at the time. But he never goes through with one of the things that I believe he may have promised to do, but was never able to do. But that call to abolish the Department of Education has been part of the conservative agenda ever since. And as many of you know, because we talked about it on this podcast, it was part of the infamous Project 2025, which I think even the administration is now admitting is actually part of their agenda, and that was not admitted during the campaign. That's worth mentioning. So let's talk about this. What exactly does the Department of Education do? And I think that's important because whether we agree with the administration or not, I'm not sure that many people understand what the Department of Education does. And I think what they do is significant. Some of what they do is significant, but they probably don't do as much as a lot of people assume that they do. All right. So I want to talk about what it is they do. One of the first things is the Department of Education manages about $1.6 trillion in outstanding federal student loan debt, right? As well as managing several student loan programs like Pell Grant and work study and all that stuff. All right. Next, the department also provides about 12 to 13% of funding for public K through 12 education. And that's according to the Education Data Initiative, excuse me. And so this includes financial assistance to schools and school districts with a high percentage of children from low-income families, as well as providing money to districts to serve and teach students with disabilities and grants for things like, adult rehabilitation services. Okay. Now, lastly, the department collects data on education facilities nationwide and enforces non-discrimination and civil rights laws in federally funded schools. And this includes Title VI and Title IX, right? They create an equalizing factor that helps to cut through education inequalities between states, creating incentives for continuity, right? They don't want, schools in different places are going to have some differences, but they don't want it to be so different that some kids are being treated unfairly or some kids just really aren't learning on the level that they should be. All right. So those were the primary functions of the Department of Education. Now, earlier I said that Trump said it would be keeping some of those core functions and that other functions would be going to other places. So not everything is just disappearing. Not everything that they do once they're dismantled is just not going to be done at all, according to the administration. So testing and funding will be handled by the states. Now, the states already handle almost 90% of the funding, or localities handle 90% of the funding, but that remaining 12 or so percent, they're saying will not be seriously reduced, will actually be sent to the states for the states to decide how to deal with it. All right. Federal loans and grants won't likely be going away since those funds are guaranteed by Congress. Right. And so it would take a congressional act to get rid of all the federal loans and all the federal grants. And according to the administration, that's not their intent to get rid of them. All right. They're saying that the Small Business Administration will now handle student loans and that the Department of Health and Human Services will take on special needs and nutrition efforts. Very important. They're saying not all of those things will go away. They're just going to other places. That's what's being said right now. Okay. That's important. Now, what the dismantling of the Department of Education has been spoken about by the left in pretty stark terms. Okay. So if you go over to the National Education Association, which is a very progressive organization, they basically saying that the administration's true agenda is to take a wrecking ball to public schools. In their eye, in their interpretation, this is all about hurting public schools and inflicting damage on millions of low-income students across the country in the process. They say, and this is from their website, that it means less resources for our most vulnerable students, which are low-income students and disabled students, larger class sizes, fewer special education services, and less civil rights protections. All right. On the other side of the argument, you have conservatives. And conservatives say that for all these years, since the 1970s, progressives have used the Department of Education and civil rights laws to push a far-right agenda that most Americans reject. And here's some of the things that they're talking about. They point out that the Department of Education for years was attempting to reinterpret the Education Amendment of 1972 in the Civil Rights Act, replacing sex with sexual orientation and gender identity. Under their new definition, and this is true, under their new definition, schools would be forced to allow boys to use girls' bathrooms and play girls' sports. The Heritage Foundation says that in more than 40 years, the achievement gap between students at the highest and lowest ends of the economic scale has stayed the same for half a century. They also point out that math scores are near historic lows today, and that taxpayers spent some $200 billion on schools during COVID. And again, whether we agree with the administration or not, it's hard to say that the Department of Education has achieved all the things that they wanted to achieve or had the impact that many think that they should have had. This is a conversation that needs to be had. I want you guys to see both sides of it. But again, as you saw the progressive side bringing up, well, what about civil rights? What about making sure that the money is spent well? Because, the conservatives are saying, look, it's only 10% of funding, right? 10, 12% of funding. Yeah, but 10, 12% of funding for a school is kind of a lot of money, right? How do they know that it's going to still fund the same things in the way that it should? All right. So those are the two sides of the argument. We have to give you that. And when I come back, I'm going to weigh in on what I think the dismantling of the Department of Education means and what it doesn't mean. I'll be right back on the Church Politics Podcast.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
And we are back on the Church Politics Podcast. So we're talking about the Department of Education. You got a little bit of that history from, how it was established, to the historical progressive standpoint on it, to the historical conservative standpoint on it, and seeing that Trump did what conservatives have been talking about doing for decades. Or he's in the process of doing what conservatives have been talking about doing for decades. And it's consequential. Any way you look at it, agree or disagree, it's no small deal. It's going to have some impact. We can argue whether the impact's going to be good or it's going to be bad. There will be a serious impact. This is a serious change, because this was an agency, an agency with a lot of authority, and that was dealing with a lot of money one way or the other. Okay. So that's where we are. Now, I've promised you that I would kind of weigh in on what I think about this. And my first thought when I think about the dismantling of the Department of Education is, I'm gonna be honest with you, because I'm concerned, what happens with the civil rights end of all this? Do I have any expectation or any faith that this particular administration will take those civil rights cases, whether they be pending or whether they be incoming, that they'll take them seriously and that they'll be handled well if they're, wherever they're moved to? And my first answer I have to give you is I just have zero faith that that'll be the case. And that is what concerns me, because that is serious. We're talking about kids. We're talking about how kids are treated. That's a big deal. All right. The other thing that comes up immediately to me, and I've said this before if you've been watching this podcast, just has to do with the Department of Government Efficiency and Elon Musk. Everything they've been doing has been rushed. They've placed very impersonal algorithms to go into departments and get rid of people's jobs that I don't think that they've taken the time to understand what they do or why they're needed. And we can see this because in some instances, they've torn apart departments and then had to go back and ask people to come back to those departments because they didn't take the time on the front end to do the due diligence, to be careful enough and precise enough to do it in a way that made sense for the objectives and the functions of that particular department. To me, that's unwise to do with a small organization. It's outrageous to do with a government organization that has such an important function. But yet, here we are, right? So that's my first thing. Most everything that Doge has done has been so rushed that it's hard to say that it has been thoughtful. And I want to, I need to bring somebody who supports Doge on here to tell me that it's okay to do it that way. Because I just don't see it. And I'm not saying there don't need to be any cuts. I'm not saying there doesn't need to be any reforms, and I'll get into that in a second. But there's a way to go about it that's thoughtful and careful and considers, the people that are impacted by this a little more than what I'm seeing right now. The next thing that I would bring up is this whole dismantling of the Department of Education, to me, seems to be more about the culture war, seems to be more about showing that they're killing off wokeness instead of consideration for the children and the future of American education. This seems to me, just like, again, this goes with what I just said. This seems to me like, once again, Doge going in there and say, hey, look how fast we can do this. Let's own the libs by doing this as fast as possible and in as a destructive way as possible. If that's your first objective, if that's your primary motivation, then again, that's not constructive and that's not helping America move forward in a healthy way. But once again, a lot of the things that we're seeing from this administration seem to be for show, seem to say, look what we're doing right now, look how fast we're doing it, and look how mad we can make the other side. To me, that's not helpful, man. I want to know that you did it thoughtfully. And I know that administrations only have so much time and they only have so much political capital. So there is a sense of urgency when you said you were going to do something, people voted for it, you're supposed to get it done. How you get it done matters. Everybody that voted for President Trump should have known that this is what he intended to do. They voted for him, so the idea that he would go in there and do it, I get it. I may not agree with it, but I get it. Still, the way you do it matters. The way you do it matters. All right, so those are my primary concerns. The civil rights issue, the civil rights, I would add to that, the funding issue. Is the funding really going to be handled in a way that's healthy and that doesn't hurt these children? If you want me to give you a guarantee that that's going to happen, you're in the wrong place. I can't give you a guarantee there, okay? But I will say this once again. I do think that when I talk to people who are more progressive, who are hearing, reading the headlines and hearing kind of, quick summaries of what's going on, there is a feeling that the Department of Education does more than it actually does. And I'm not saying it's insignificant. I think it's significant. But I do think there need to be some education on what it actually does. Because I will say this. The Department of Education, to me, did some significant things, some things that I'm thankful somebody in the government was doing. But it did need reform. I would be lying to you if I said that I don't think progressives at times did use the Department of Education to push forward an agenda that the American people did not agree with. I would be lying to you if I didn't say that the Department of Education was used to push, in some instances, now this isn't the whole of it, but was used to push an agenda and a point of view that never went through the public discourse. And this is one of my biggest problems that I have with progressives and academia and many of their elected officials is that when they get an idea and they want to push forward that idea, they don't bring that idea to the people. They just use academia and government to force it on the people. And so if we're going to talk about Elon Musk and oligarchy, which I hope we do, which I hope we continue to have that conversation, what I'm trying to tell you is things like transgenderism not going through the public discourse and just being pushed on schools and pushed on parents from a government agency, to me, that's oligarchy. To me, that has a lot to do with the several billionaires who are behind that agenda and they're pushing it. That's the same thing. So if you're going to talk about oligarchy and you want to do so credibly, you got to talk about things like that. And so to me, there was a need to have some reform and to be more honest about what ideologies are being pushed from the Department of Education. And maybe I wish I didn't have to say that. Maybe I wish I could just take the side of, one or the other, but that's the truth. That was a problem. The other problem we have to recognize is our education system in general, especially when you're talking about low income areas, is much to be desired. So if I'm going to come to you and act like the Department of Education was just the savior of urban education, I can't look at the numbers and honestly do that. And this is the type of nuance, this is the type of complicated analysis honest analysis that I think Christians have to render. Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree with everything that I've said, but I do think it's just more complicated than Republicans hate low-income students, don't care about low-income students. They're taking away this department that was actually raising these students up and bringing everybody up in a significant way. It wasn't quite that. It's not quite that simple. And so what I don't want you to do, and what I've seen a lot of people do, is just dealing in the narrative from one side, just accepting the storyline from one side and understanding that this is a little more difficult than that. Now, let me say this. The other thing I'll say is that in general, I do think that education has to be community first. Like, the community is first and foremost responsible for the education of their children. Now, to me, this is where I would disagree with conservatives. That does not mean that there's no significant federal role that needs to be played, especially when we're talking about civil rights and things of that nature, and not civil rights in some of the ways that were redefined by the left. All right. But education generally should be community focused. And I will say, and I have to look myself in the mirror when I say this too, many of us got far too comfortable with leaving education to people outside of our community, to allowing people all the way in DC, all the way in different bureaucracies to shape the culture and ideologies that are being presented to kids in the classroom. That's not their job. But many of us allowed that to happen. And so even if you disagree with parts of the conservative side, as I do, I think there's something to local control and community say and community involvement in their children's education. But let me leave you with this, and at least for this particular segment. If you are really, really upset by the dismantling of the Department of Education, then don't just sit there and sulk. Don't just sit there and become more cynical and become more bitter and keep watching cable news and getting madder and madder. Do something about it. If you're mad about the dismantling of the Department of Education, then get up and teach some kids how to read. If there's nothing else that motivates you to get up and become part of a literacy program, to get your church involved with teaching kids how to read, it should be this. If you really care as much as you say you do, I don't want to just see a whole bunch of social media posts. I don't want to just be getting a whole bunch of texts from you every single day, every single hour about what Trump is doing, what he's not doing. Get up and use the power you have to help the kids and add to the education so that you can help them move forward in a better way. Everything is not about what the federal government is doing. And maybe this will force some of us, I'm not saying it's good, but I'm saying maybe this will force some of us to stop being so passive and so aloof when it comes to our children's education. I think the Department of Education had a significant role, but what I also know is that the Department of Education was not going to fix the literacy crisis in our community. It wasn't going to do it. It was incapable of doing it. The only thing that's going to stop the literacy crisis in our communities is the community itself. Is people getting up off the couch, brushing off their shoulders, getting the cynicism away from them and all the defeatism away from them, and helping themselves to improve these children's education. I'll be right back on the Church Politics Podcast.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
And I'm back on the Church Politics Podcast. Now, someone who has only heard basically the storylines from one side of this conversation about the Department of Education or the other might have some questions. And if I need to summarize what I was saying in that last segment, I'm very concerned about the Department of Education and what's happening with the dismantling of it, especially the hastiness and all that. I also thought it was a department that probably had been misused at times and could use some reform. So do I think this is the end of the world when it comes to American education? It's not the end of the world when it comes to American education. It's just not. Could it be hurtful? It could be hurtful. And I can't guarantee you that the administration is going to do exactly what they said they were going to do. But it's not as simple as some of the simplified narratives that I've heard kind of going around. It should not cause you to go into complete hysteria. Okay. Now, some of you might be saying, well, man, if you're concerned about it, then why do you need to why can't you just take a side and move forward with the side that gets things more right? Right? Like, Justin, when we talk about the Department of Education, either tell us to support the progressive point of view or tell us to support the conservative point of view. And when you don't do that, it just seems like you're just not doing it because you don't like to agree with either side. Somebody, could say that. But here's my response to that. When you're talking about what should education look like, when you're talking about what should our society look like from a practical standpoint, or even some theoretical matters, there's a lot of different options there. So when you tell somebody, hey, this is like telling somebody, hey, tell me what you think our society should look like. Right? Like, please inform me on what your vision for what society should look like. And then after you tell them to tell you what it looks like, then telling them, but you can only choose from these two options. So you have this broad array of potential perspectives that you could take. But what our society does is they say, yeah, we want to know, we want you to be innovative. We want to get this right. We want to fix it. But two people have already weighed in, and you got to choose one of those two options. And what I'm saying is not that I'm trying to disagree with those two options. What I'm saying is that those two options are broken. And I think What you have to try to do is if you really have to try, to me, as a Christian, to look at one of those two sides and completely agree with one of the two sides. You don't have to try to disagree with them. If you're just trying to find the right answer, there's a very high probability that it's not on one of those two sides. There's a very high probability that both of them could be wrong on a certain issue. So when people come to me and act like you have to try to disagree with them, I would shoot back and I would say, no, as a Christian, I would have to try and cut off my arm and cut off parts of my heart to actually fit in with them. That's where the trying comes. So to me, it's not trying to disagree or, trying to be controversial or trying to be disagreeing for the sake of disagreement, right? But I believe that it would be extremely irresponsible and dishonest for me to disagree just to be provocative, right? To disagree when one side is clearly right would be dishonest and deceitful of me. But what I'm telling you is, and I think I don't just say it, I actually try to prove it, that on many instances, the right and the left are both wrong or significantly wrong on a lot of important issues. So when I tell you the Department of Education is a mixed bag, then I really think it's a mixed bag. And if an issue is a mixed bag, but I come and tell you that it's not a mixed bag, then I'm being dishonest in that instance too. If I see a bag of apples and oranges, then I'm doing you a disservice to tell you that it's just a bag of oranges, even if there's more oranges than there are apples. See, y'all got me preaching right now. The point that I'm making is this isn't as simple as the Department of Education was good and the Department of Education was bad. There were some significantly good aspects of it to me when you're talking about the civil rights aspect of it, especially if you separate the changing definitions and the manipulation of it. And then there were some parts that I didn't think were so great, and a dependence on it or an understanding of it as being far greater than it actually was. And so that's what we're trying to get at when we address issues. The AND campaign never goes out of its way to say, oh, I got to find a reason why the progressives are wrong. Or I got to find a reason why the conservatives are wrong because that's just part of our brand. No. With all the potential answers out there in the world, for me to act like I always agree with one of these two out of whoever knows how many different options, that's the compromise. That's the deceit. And that's why we actually try to get to the right answer and the right position and not just the right side. All right? So I hope y'all understand that. I hope you appreciate this episode. We try to dig into a very serious issue, an issue that demands nuance, whether we want to give it nuance or not, and just trying to be as honest as possible. And again, you don't have to agree with me on some of the points made. As a Christian, you do have to look at it critically, and you can't just give one side a pass on something they're doing wrong. I can't just give Elon Musk a pass for going in there and destroying whole departments without clearly taking enough time to know who does what and what's important. I can't give progressives a pass for clearly, in some instances, using the Department of Education to push an agenda that the American people have not okayed. And especially when it comes to children, you can't do that. We have a public discourse for a reason, and you can think you're as smart as you want to think you are. You still don't have a right to push things on people without bringing it through that public discourse. And that's what the left doesn't do. All right? Well, Ann Camp, you know what it is. There's a cross that neither political conservatism nor progressivism is fit to bear. There's a civic hearing in need of faithful witnesses who love social justice and won't surrender the truth to be loved by the world. Politic with the boldness and compassion of Jesus Christ. Until next time, Ann Camp, I'll let you.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.